Welcome back, everybody. If you could take your seats, we'll begin in just a couple of minutes. Thank you. All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Alessandro Vitelli. I'm the Communications Advisor at IETA, and it's my pleasure to bring you this panel involving analysts and traders to look at the markets, to look at the events of the past few months, and to have a think forward as to what we might expect to see in 2023. With me today, from my right, Mark Tilley, correspondent for Carbon Pulse. I'm sure you're all familiar with their work. Then we have Marcelo Labre from Viridios. Cyril Castisse here, immediately on my right from Carbon Analysis, BHP. And on my left here, Chimin Zhang from ACT. And then all the way on my left here, Sam Gledhill, who is with, let me get this right, it's Trove Research. A very well-known outfit, Trove Research. So welcome to you all. We're going to just start with Sam giving us a little bit of a view into what has been observed in terms of demand-supply pricing and activity in the voluntary markets. If we could bring up the first slides, please.
How's this, Mike? There we go. Cool, thank you. Great to be here. Thank you, Alessandro, for the introductions. So just framing the perspective that Trove's going to bring today, we are carbon market analysts and focus more broadly on just pricing dynamics, but so the state and play of demand and supply in global markets. But we'll be bringing some of our pricing observations as well. So this first slide is starting at the top, either the end or the start of this value chain, depending on how you look at it at the demand side, observing the net zero targets that are being set under SBTI. And I won't dwell on this for too long, but you can see pretty steep uptick in new targets set. And that corresponds to a commitment to engage in voluntary carbon markets and to engage in the decarbonisation process. So I think in general, I can speak to this slide a bit more broadly when we dive into the Q&A later, but pretty positive in terms of commitments made and intentions for long-term offsetting. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just to bring the time horizon in a little bit and think more about retirements over the past few years, there's been a lot of talk of market activity dropping off this year, particularly secondary market activity. And we've seen that perhaps reflected in prices and volumes put through. But if we talk about retirements, that is, the use of credits against a particular claim, the story is somewhat more positive. So you've got a big spike there in Q4 of 2021, which was a bit of a post-COP26 effect. Also a very large volume of retirements that went through from kind of crypto-based retirements. So slightly discounting that Q4 bar of last year, quite flat retirements quarter on quarter, which is ultimately reflective of corporates continuing to engage in this market and retiring credits to make claims against their commitments. Next slide, please. Another a very interesting sort of correlations graph. So this is the S&P 500 tracked against retirements, and it's pretty pro-cyclical. And it's interesting. People often sort of ponder on this, whether or not carbon markets are correlating to normal equity markets. And I think this is quite telling. It's particularly what's been going on with the war in Ukraine, and has certainly put a dampener on this market, as it has done in equity markets globally. Cool. Next slide, please. A quick market sizing one. So we are at Trove forecasting approximately 1.2 billion primary market size by the end of the year. So a slight uptick in overall market value, but that is to some extent hiding what's going on, which is roughly similar volumes of retirements, but a greater value of individual credits. So that marks the sort of increase in the type of credits that are being retired vis-a-vis higher quality, higher price credits. Cool, next slide, please. And finally, coming to a bit of pricing, which is why we're all here today. So to end on a couple of pricing slides from Trove. We track the exchange-traded prices, but also prices traded OTC, which is somewhat of a more opaque market. And what we have seen is, as you would expect, a slow decline over this year, particularly since the war in Ukraine. You can see that decline from an average of 9.3 down to around 6.4 as of October this year. And also interesting, much larger spreads as well. Cool, next slide, please. This then begins to get a little bit more detailed. So at Trove, we track very granular pricing down to about 20, 30 different sub-asset classes, but you see the high-level project types tracked here. And I think the main takeaway from this slide is we see a maintenance of the premiums paid for nature-based credits. And that has continued throughout the year and continues, and indeed the price declines have been more reflective of other project types than nature-based. And I think high-level takeaway from this is kind of continued and growing focus from the buy side on nature-based credits that are continuing to be perceived as higher quality and of more contributory to additional climate action. Cool. Thank you very much, Alessandro.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Marcelo, you've also done some work looking, your company looks at the market, looks at the prices, and maybe you have some observations as well to make to accompany Sam's?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of slides, Alessandro.
Coming right up.
And just would like to start to talk about what Viridius AI does. So that's one of the business within Viridius Group. And we are basically a technology and data powerhouse. So we really receive contributions across the wider market of prices, of all types of credits, all regions, all types of standards. And as such, we're able to produce analysis like what you're going to see here. In fact, can we flip this slide, please? So just wanted to start with this chart. And we're going to start producing this in a form of a market commentary. But this is the first time we're showing this to the public, produced out of our own data sets. And this is basically 3 indices, or I would say price reference calculations that we did internally at the company. And the blue line that you see there is a consolidation of the commoditized instruments. And when I say commoditized instruments, that includes the NGO, GNT, GNT Plus from ACX, and so on. Nature-based commoditized instruments. And it's a unitary index, meaning on 1st of January 2022, the value of that index is 1. So as you can see, not surprising, from October and November 2021, there was really a significant increase in the market, and you see that through the chart prior to January. And there was a correction, as we saw in some slides, there was a correction during the course of this year. However, what I wanted to highlight, and I wanted to really make a couple of points here. The blue line is the commoditized instrument, experienced a very significant volatility. And you see there on 9th of March 2022, for example, we had that dip in the market, right? And we saw pretty much everything going down, but it recovered a bit and then it went down again. So there is very high volatility. Now flipping to the other 2 indices that we have on the chart, those are produced directly from the offset prices that we have in our platform. Okay, the green line is for the nature-based Asia projects, and the yellow line is for the nature-based global projects. And what you will observe there, which may sound counterintuitive for a lot of people, and we see a lot of these debates in the market as you go to conferences and so on, is that the prices of the offsets directly, they are very stable. And in that mix, there is even considered lower quality projects, not only even high quality projects. And you can see the prices are fairly stable there. They do not experience as much volatility as the commoditized indices or instruments. And if you are a trader, if you are a bank, a financial institution, and you're trying to market your books, so you can just imagine if you use a commoditized instrument, how much, for example, your VAR is going to be very high to start with. And you are proxying a price obviously you are going to take provisions from a finance department and so on. There are a number of problems of using a commoditized instrument as a benchmark to mark books, where using direct prices from offsets have a number of advantages. The green line, again, back to green line, which is Asia, you can see is a little bit above the global line. When you're talking about nature-based projects, you see very high-quality projects, REDD+ projects, for example, in Asia, like Southern Calderon, Kyocema, Rimbarai, and so on. That explains why it hasn't come down as much during the course of the year, although it approached the same level at the end of November. So this is for the nature-based slides. So just for completion, can you flip this slide, please? So now we're seeing the technology-based projects. And the story is very similar when you're looking at the commoditized instruments. And now we're talking about the GEO and the CET and so on, consolidated in an index. And now we see the green line below the global line, which is the yellow line, which in Asia, you have a number of renewable projects, especially from India and China, which go in the market for lower price in general. That explains the higher trend down compared to the global index. So flip the slide, please. And that's it for the presentation. And then the point to be made is really that. So the trend is going down, but it's not going down as much. It's very stable, as much as commoditized instruments. Despite of geopolitical issues, despite of a recession that we're entering at the moment, it seems that actual offset prices are fairly stable, and that's the message, to really take home.
Thank you, Marcelo. Jimin, to come to you, you're involved in the market on a trading basis. You speak to the buyers, you speak to the sellers. We've seen here some data showing evolutions, a decline in prices. How is that being reflected in what you're seeing, what you're hearing from people?
Yeah, I think I can reflect upon the graphs I think Marcelo just showed. Indeed, I think because we are the trader, so we are client-facing. So in our daily job, we talk to most of the corporates to really identify what they need, right, and what are their preferences. And indeed, I think in this year we do see that I won't say the demand is diminishing. It's more like those corporates they sort of prolong their decision-making process. It's not like Q4 last year, everyone was just rushing into the market. Now it's more like, okay, they take time to really think what type of project they want to buy, and also they strengthen their scrutiny towards not only the climate impact, but also the other additionalities of the project. So they really do research on the projects, and then they after all those checks, and then they make decision about the procurement. So that's why we see the market. That's why we feel the market becomes much slower. But at the end, I think they say the fundamental demand, meaning the demands from the corporates and users, are still there. They didn't change their direction to not using carbon offsets at all. They continue to use this, and we do see an influx of new players into the market. But the thing is that now we do see the divergence of different behaviors of those corporates. So, like say the incumbents who are more experienced, now they start not only looking for credits to buy, but more like in long term. They're more favored in long-term offtake, or even like invest in projects by themselves, because they think in that way they can actually claim more, impact to the environment. Yes.
An interesting development then, that people are becoming stakeholders as well as just buyers or corporate purchasers. They're actually taking a stake in the future of the market and in the work on the ground.
Yes, indeed.
Great stuff. Cyril, talking from a corporate point of view, someone who is, who has a carbon footprint and a strategy to reach net zero, what does this tell you, and what choices do you face when you're in the market looking to look at carbon reductions?
Thank you, Alessandro. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Cyril Casissa. I'm a principal carbon analyst at BHP, one of the largest mining company. I'm part of the analytical side of the market, and I have colleagues here in the room that will also participate in other side events to discuss more the sourcing strategies and due diligence that we do on projects. So I'm very happy to be here in person. It's the last climate summit I've been participating in. It was 2019 in Bangkok. So this is great to see your faces. Let me take the topic from the angle of first the compliance carbon markets, the decarbonization strategies, and the role of the voluntary carbon market. So we already have numbers and prices on the voluntary carbon market side here. So in the region, there's already billions of tons of CO2 that are priced with the compliance carbon markets. I will just cite a few of them. Development that happened last year and this year. China launched the largest carbon market in the world, covering more than 4 gigatons of CO2, only with the power and heat generation. This carbon market is expected to extend to industries, and we don't have the date, but in the coming years, is planning to be covering more than 7 gigatons of CO2 before the end of the 14th five-year plan, so before 2025. In these schemes, the carbon market allows users to utilize carbon offset up to 5%. So you can imagine, and it was said in the plenary session, the volume will be very huge, and it will stimulate the demand of voluntary carbon markets. And we can also observe at the end of the first compliance period for the China ETS that this influenced the Chinese domestic certified emission reduction schemes credit prices at the end of 2021. And it's very nice to hear that China is also considering to opening the national carbon market, perhaps to the international voluntary carbon markets for compliance issues. Another one example is Singapore that has released its carbon tax budget in 2022, and we have a clear price trajectory starting to increase by 2024, and also opening to an utilization of carbon offset maximum up to 5%. The last one is example could be Australia that has been revising its emission reduction target by 2030 and is also reviewing its safeguard mechanisms. And there is many other countries that we heard this morning that is considering carbon pricing policies at domestic level. So what that says, despite that the global economic context and geopolitical context that we had in 2022, we can observe that there is a likelihood that there will be more and more emissions in countries and by sectors covered by a carbon price. And so from my experience working on carbon markets for the last 10 years, this won't happen tomorrow. So I heard many times that there will be a new carbon price instrument next year, and it took, by experience, 2 to 3 years to get it implemented and to have the price on emissions. But what is important, nevertheless, this provides the policy framework and guidance for accelerating decarbonization actions. And to drive this decarbonization, these compliance carbon prices will have to improve in design, be more stringent, and there will be a likelihood of the compliance carbon price to increase over the midterm to long term to enable this decarbonization. So this brings me to my second point, which is the need for accelerating decarbonizations to reach, to limit the global warming. And so this is already, in fact, integrated by corporates into the decarbonization and net zero long-term goal. So in BHP, we have released in 2021 our Climate Transition Action Plan that describes and outlines the updated approach for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have at BHP net zero long-term goals for both operational emissions and our Scope 3 emissions by 2050. And so to progress into these goals, we define interim targets and interim goals, and BHP is first prioritizing internal decarbonizations through structural abatement. And after that, we recognized the role of voluntary carbon market in a transition phase to contribute to the net zero goals and enable also technology innovations in hard-to-abate sector, particularly where today's technology are lacking, and we need a more low-carbon alternatives solution in the future. So in the voluntary carbon markets, this brings me to my last point. We are a participant in the market, and we look to enable and scale up high quality and high environmental integrity voluntary carbon markets. So I would say for these carbon markets, today we face a situation, I fully agree with the global demand structures of the voluntary commitments coming here, and that will generate and already generate a huge demand and expectation of demand growth. But we are today in a transition phase, I will say, to build and establish this robust carbon market. Here there is two elements of this transition phase that come in addition to the global economic context and geopolitical situations that we have in 2022. The first one is through the operationalization of the Article 6 of Paris Agreement, so that has been discussed in the previous panel sessions. And so this is progressing, and the rules will be defined on Article 6 with the aim to scale up the international voluntary carbon market, while guaranteeing and ensuring that there is a robust greenhouse gas accounting in parties and through the NDCs. The other element that bring us into this transition phase is that they use expectations, but we also need to agree with the common rules, standards, and principles that will make a high quality and high environmental integrity carbon market. So here we're looking very closely about initiatives, international initiatives such as ICVCM, VCMI, SBTI, that will come out next year, hopefully, with these rules, and that will be well integrated by the market participants. So to summarize my interventions, the carbon market has a good promising next years and next coming years. It will help to go to achieve net zero, but also to go beyond the current climate commitment. First, by providing the guidance for internal decarbonization and emission reductions, structural abandonment. And second, by enabling mitigation actions that won't be happening in other places of the value chains or in different sectors. And so to promote the scale-up of removals, both technology-based but also nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mark, you're an observer, like I am, of the markets. You sort of stand aside and just act as a sort of objective eye. What has been changing over the past year? Where are we going? From what we've been hearing, from what Sam and from Marcelo showed us in the price, and going through COP and coming out into 2023, what's coming along?
Thanks, Alessandro. So just to pick up on Quinn's point, there's an increasing number of international voluntary traders getting involved, particularly in Australia's carbon market, as well as Japanese firms buying into Australian project developers, as well as land in New Zealand to begin their own carbon forestry projects, to begin generating credits to offset their own emissions. So an example for that was in May when Mitsui and Nomura bought New Forests, which is one of the world's biggest generators of forestry carbon credits, with projects across Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. So it's it's part of this trend where these corporates are looking to not only act as buyers of carbon credits, but generate their own carbon credits with their own projects, but also to learn from carbon markets that are well established themselves, such as Australia and New Zealand. In terms of Australia and New Zealand sort of regional sort of outlook, Australia is in the process of developing its Indo-Pacific Carbon Offset Scheme, which is IPCOS. So originally, that was launched by the government last year, the previous government last year at COP26, and it was initially designed as a way for Australian companies to be able to purchase offsets developed in the region. So they had Fiji and PNG sign up. Since then, since the new government came to power in May, they've reoriented themselves slightly in terms of the focus of IPCOS. They're looking at it more from a capacity building exercise, so tooling up these countries with the skills needed to form, regulate, and execute Article 6 markets. And there's some wider sort of commentary in the Australian market that Australia might be going a bit too slowly with these sorts of developments because of all of these Article 6 arrangements being organised in terms of bilateral agreements in the region. That we saw a massive announcement, slew of announcements at COP27. In New Zealand's case, they have something of 100 million tonnes of ITMOs needed to meet their 2030 NDCs. So they've been starting their own sort of conversations with partner countries to potentially develop Article 6 partnerships. However, they're very early days in the discussion, and they haven't sort of publicly said who those countries are. But they want to take a very sort of much more sort of bespoke agreement sort of approach to it. So they want to address not only meeting their own NDCs, but also their partner countries' sustainable development goals. So I think they're looking at it very much on a sort of a partnership by partnership basis, rather than sort of this much broader sort of slew of partnerships that we've seen in other countries in the region, such as Japan, for example. Canvassing all of that, though, specifically in Australia's perspective, is there's been a lot of high-profile commentary relating to greenwashing, relating to questioning the integrity of specifically the Australian domestic carbon market. But that kind of also bleeds through into the voluntary carbon market, because the Australian government has a certification scheme where companies can classify themselves as being carbon neutral by using offsets from the voluntary market. So there's been a whole sort of lot of commentary this year specifically around like the questioning of that, the integrity of these schemes. Reactionary to that, the government is in the process of conducting a review into the domestic market, and that's supposed to release its findings at the end of this year. And so, yeah, that sort of just, that kind of, it's, I suppose, hindered the progress in some elements, because there's this constant sort of questioning and sort of a bit slightly kind of hand-wringing in the market about that, given that it is so sort of prolific in the media right now, in Australia at least. In New Zealand, there's been a lot of conversations around the proliferation of forestry in New Zealand and how that affects rural communities. There's a lot of a powerful agricultural lobby group that has been sort of fighting against the development of a lot of the forestry projects. And so, yeah, there's a lot of sort of stakeholder concerns in these markets that is potentially, you know, interesting lessons to learn from the voluntary perspective of how you get your stakeholder engagement right. Yeah, that's sort of how that goes. I mean, in terms of looking forward for Australia, we've got the safeguard mechanism reforms underway, and that's expected to be a really big sort of driver in domestic demand in Australian carbon credit units. But again, the policy settings for that haven't been announced. So there's a degree of sort of policy flux in both of these markets, that the market is kind of essentially slightly in limbo, waiting for in many respects. But it's also, yeah, also these schemes, sort of how do they affect both of these markets? Are kind of potentially, there's been some commentary that they're moving too slow in the voluntary space because of all these regional arrangements going on in terms of Article 6. So we'll have to wait and see for how those progress.
Thanks, Mark. It just sounds like the internal debate there is happening almost without reference to Article 6.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I talked to someone at COP27 from a major newspaper, and he said, if I tried to explain Article 6 to my readership, my editor would probably fire me. So it might be, you know, because we have these domestic schemes in Australia and New Zealand, there's probably the commentary around it could potentially be quite insular in that respect. But at the same time, you do get sort of that commentary of how these schemes work in the voluntary market, of sort of the commentary around carbon cowboys and the like, that sort of flows through. And also because the governments in these countries are very much looking at emissions reductions at source. You know, Australia updated its NDC, and in Australia, example, there's a lot of promise and potential on the government's messaging of, you know, becoming a renewable energy superpower sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's not as much of a priority for them because we have this massive potential to decarbonise by using, you know, the vast tracts of land that we have and that sort of thing.
Keep it at home.
Yeah.
Don't worry about Article 6 so much.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jimin, I want to come back to you because, again, you're one of an active participant in the market. You'll be seeing and sensing shifts and changes in patterns of behavior. Now, we've talked about already a little bit about what corporates are doing. Sam, you also have some data, I think, that suggests that retirement rates are still high if the purchasing may not be the same levels. What are we seeing in terms of, you know, a movement towards or away from certain class of carbon offsets? Is there a new favorite? Is there a new technology emerging that we should all be looking out for?
Yeah, sure. I think in this year we do see like the demand for different types of technologies divergent, and also in terms of geographical preferences, we also see there's a paradigm shift. Well, maybe I start from the geography part. As we all know that in the past like 10, 15 years, I think China and India were the major supplier of, let's say, relatively cheap credits to the market. But from this year on, we actually witnessed that most, I won't say most, but I mean a significant higher, let's say, percentage of end buyers, they start voluntarily excluding the credits from China, and we see that trend continues. In that sense, yeah, I think they will have, a supporting effect to the market price, because imagine if the majority of end consumers, they stop buying the cheap credits from China, then yeah, they have to source somewhere else where the price will be much higher. So it will stabilize, well, at least like stabilize the downturn of the market price. Yeah, and also don't forget that from actually in the past COP27, that China, not an official announcement, but some senior government advisor actually give the hint that China might eventually become a buyer of international voluntary carbon credits, and that will be a game changer. But yeah, that will be a more, let's say, mid to long term. So that's I think the most significant change in terms of let's say geographical preferences of the end users or end consumers, and then in terms of the technology part, we can see from the previous presentation, I think, of course, nature-based is definitely a very hot topic, and we do see the demand for, let's say, nature-based credits are increasing. But that is not affordable by all the players. So I think the corporates, I think only really the top corporates, or let's say the corporates, they have been in this market for many years, they will start let's say really buying the nature-based credits. But still, we see a lot of, let's say, mid to small size enterprises and maybe the new players into the markets. For those guys, I think they would prefer more like tech-based, but with higher quality. For example, they say a cookstove projects or water or clean drinkable water projects. And also another interesting part which we see from the market recently is that we do see a huge spike of, let's say, what we call the advanced water management projects, which is not only in China, but also in many other countries, which is basically about the rice cultivation, right? So it's more as an agricultural project. So those they are not really nature-based. They are not really, let's say, carbon removal, but people consider it as premium projects, and still it has very, let's say, other positive contributions in addition to climate change. So for many, let's say, medium to new players or size of companies, they tend to buy those type of projects because in terms of, let's say, the benefit they can get and also the cost, I think those are with the best balance, I would say. Yeah, and I think the last point is that what I see from the markets, actually, like the feeling when I interact with most of corporates, I think Sarah also touched upon this point, the clarity of the guidelines, like what they can do and what they can get out of using those credits, or what they can claim by redeeming those credits, are extremely important. Without those clear guidelines, yeah, many corporates they want to do something, but they're just so confusing about what they can do. So I think that's definitely something we need to address. And I believe in the next couple of days of the conference, we'll definitely talk more on this. Yeah.
And it's worth also highlighting the high-level expert group that issued its net zero guidelines at COP, and the International Standardization Organization, which also issued net zero guidelines both at COP, both of them reinforcing the point that internal decarbonization pathway is essential before you even start thinking about going down the route of buying carbon offsets. So the guidance is coming. As you said, the message needs to be transferred more widely, perhaps. Sam, I want to come back to you for a second, because we were talking about the retirement rate of offsets among corporates compared to issuance and purchases. And I wanted to know if you have any insights into how that is reflecting behavior changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So volumetrically, what we're seeing is pretty flat rates of retirement quarter on quarter compared to this time last year, which I think is interesting. I think it's a positive sign. It shows that end buyers are continuing to retire credits to make positive environmental claims. But just to zoom out a little bit and to continue to speak a bit more broadly on the behavior of corporates and where the market's going, I certainly agree with Cumin's comments on a focus toward nature-based credits that are to some extent perceived as higher quality, certainly those that are removal-based credits. And we could talk for the rest of this panel on sort of the minutiae details around what quality means and why we prefer nature-based and this or that. But to zoom out, I think the question is, why is this dynamic taking place? What's going on the buy side? And the key change is that people care more and people understand more. The buy side is beginning to understand what it means to engage in a high quality offset. And indeed, the world's eyes are now on the buy side, forcing them down that path of understanding what it means to engage in integrity. And the implications of that are two or potentially threefold. One is the credit that I am purchasing of a high quality, and by that, is it additional? Is the capital I'm allocating to this project going to produce environmental protection that would otherwise have not happened? A second big category is the discussion of Article 6. And is there some sort of critical risk that the asset class that I'm engaging in is to some extent going to be dismissed by other global players as for some extent being non-eligible for my country's NDC and therefore a threat to my strategy of engaging with credits? And then I think the third speaks to the credit type discussion and whether or not I am internally abating initially or doing credit purchasing down my emission reduction pathway and then buying credits at the end of it, or some combination between the two. And here again speaks to the lack of clarity. I think this year we've seen, again, to speak to Cumin's point, of people holding back a little bit. And that's not because they're backing away from carbon markets, but because they understand that there really is not a coalescence around what is the most sensible thing to do. I mean, even SBTI have changed their tune slightly this year to say, actually, we would, to some extent, actively encourage corporates to engage in carbon markets and to offset their emissions on the way down their emission reduction pathway, as opposed to simply abate internally, abate the supply chain, and to purchase credits right at the end. So to bring those comments together, I think, irrespective of the certain credit types that are being bought, the level of retirements that we're seeing being put through, corporates are engaging more, their level of understanding is far higher, and as a result, we are beginning to see a coalescence around what it means to buy a high quality carbon credit. And indeed, organizations like the ICVCM are contributing to that ongoing debate.
And what we got out of COP with this invention of the mitigation contribution emission reduction kind of confuses us a little bit further, and we really need to wait for the experts, the lawyers, and whoever else to actually lay down exactly what that is and what we can use it for.
Indeed, but I think you can go in two directions from that, right? You can either say, oh dear, that's really confusing and therefore I'm going to stay away from carbon markets. Or you could say, actually, what this means is the implications of this mitigation contribution unit is that I can engage in carbon credit markets irrespective of there being no decision on Article 6, and for that to be recognized as being valid, for that to be recognized as contributing additional climate action somewhere in the world, and for me as an organization to allocate capital to support that taking place. And within that dynamic, you have potentially countries that, particularly less developed countries, that may never be allocating capital at the governmental level to certain types of emission reductions because they don't have the infrastructure, and may never be engaging with an NDC eligible credit, or indeed it will be 10 years down the line before they have the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure and the political infrastructure to do that. And therefore allowing a mechanism for capital to flow to emission reductions inside those nations, I think is a positive thing, and should be encouraging organizations to do that without a concern that there'll be any Article 6-based backlash in 2025.
So we should lean in. Okay.
Indeed.
Thank you. Marcelo, I noticed in your charts, which you displayed during your presentation, Asian nature-based prices averaging slightly higher than the global average, and Asian tech-based averaging slightly less than. Does that reflect this preference that we're seeing towards, nature-based on a global basis is also being reflected here in Asia? Is it from buyers in this region who are also going for the nature-based over the tech?
Yeah, absolutely, Alessandro. And just to reinforce what the other speakers said, right? Really the story of the VCM, of the voluntary carbon market, in contrast to Kyoto, right? CDM days, all we cared about was carbon emission reduction, and that was it. So the story of the VCM is about co-benefits, and that's the clear measure of quality there. And where do we find co-benefits? Primarily nature-based projects, although some technology-based projects will have them as well, but you see that in abundance in nature-based, especially forestry projects, right? And when you go even to the removals like blue carbon and reforestation, and if you involve communities in that, then even more, right? But that's what we see, the reflection of higher prices, for example, in Asia for that index, is precisely because we have really a number of very high quality REDD+ projects in Asia that reflects the price behavior accordingly. When we switch to the technology-based side, so you mentioned that earlier, right? So the cheap credits from China. So you see a number of much cheaper credits on renewables from China, India, that pulls down the index. So the fundamentals are very well explained there, right? And one more point to be made, right, again, as a segue from what the other speakers were saying, is that, yeah, we do see a slight decline in prices, right? We see a softening of demand and everything. But, all those factors mentioned here, they are valid. But in my opinion, there is a bigger factor here, which is the economy, right? So carbon credits are still a discretionary expense, right, for a corporate. And when you start having a recessionary period, as we're entering now, of course you're going to think twice before spending millions of dollars on credits, right? Despite that, we haven't seen the correction on this asset class compared to other asset classes. You look around, equities, credit, and so on and so forth, which is an extremely positive message, right, that the wider market is sending to this asset class. So I personally have, at Viridius in general, we have a very positive view of the market going forward. And this is the time really to organize the house, to set up your systems, your processes, engage with projects, because what's about to come after we come out of this economic downturn is going to be really bright for this market.
Thank you. Cyril, I'd like to come back to the idea of compliance markets. You touched on the idea of compliance markets here in the region. We've had no new compliance market in the past couple of years really emerging. China predates, if you like, the last couple of years. What are the challenges that a compliance market is going to face as it comes to life in the environment in which we currently are, with the voluntary market taking off, with Article 6 discussions taking off? What are the challenges for a compliance market now? Are they different than they were back in the day when the European market was starting and when the Californian market was starting? And what are the particular challenges here in Asia?
Thanks. This is a very big question, so we try to answer very quickly and sharply. There is today an unprecedented global economic context and energy crisis that country has to face, so they have to rethink their energy security first. And carbon pricing policies is across sectorial policies to price emissions that need to be integrated into the business. That is not easy to pass and get the support from the different stakeholders and the market participants. So this, of course, is a transition phase, as I said before. There is experience for other countries, but every country has a very different national circumstances and willingness to use carbon pricing or not. So, as I said, it's not in one day, but the experience sharing around the region, we participated yesterday in a carbon pricing dialogue between countries, and we could see that all the Asian countries are considering carbon pricing, and this experience sharing will speed up the way they will be able to implement them and reform them to make them more efficient at the end. So I have a huge expectation for the colleagues we heard from Indonesia with a trial pilot and all the benefits they can get for the international experiences.
Do you think that there's a hybrid model along the lines of what Colombia has done with its carbon tax, which can be paid for with offsets? Is that potentially a solution?
It's potentially a solution. It's also what we think with Singapore tax that's going to open to 5% utilization of international carbon credits. China also implemented that. Australia, with the safeguard mechanism, still rely on accuse that could be used for compliance. So hybrid system is more and more the design of compliance carbon pricing policies in the future. Going toward the long-term net zero goals, we may see some convergence in terms of design for scaling up the ambition and the emission reductions that will be generated and encouraged by this scheme over time. So we may not aim to one global carbon market at the end, we don't believe that, but there will be learning from the different experiences with different design that could converge in some aspect.
And is there a scenario that sees Asian countries taking on cap and trade systems, with really declining absolute limits on carbon, or is it still going to be something a little bit more loose than that?
We have New Zealand that already have that in place, but also in the case of China, they're starting with an necessity-based allocation system, but they're already considering how they could transit to a cap and trade system in the future. No date yet planned on that, but the policymakers are strongly considering these options.
Thank you. Let's think about 2023 and maybe sort of just put your forecasting hat on. What do you think we're going to see in 2023 in terms of trends? Is there going to be an emerging asset class within carbon that's going to take over and become, the one to have? And is there going to be perhaps an evolution in terms of the market?
I feel there might have been about 15 questions in there, Alessandro, but I'll do what I can. So, trends. I think I'll speak very briefly to technology trends. There's a lot of talk of technology-based carbon removals. I have some hopes that we may move in positive direction there, but I think it's not something that we can necessarily rely on. A lot of capital is flowing to technology-based removals, direct air capture. Some really, really amazing things are taking place. The extent to which they're scalable and will be able to be done at a price that's affordable in a market where corporates are not necessarily legally obliged to engage is a different question I wouldn't attempt to answer now. So I think that's one thing to look out for, particularly ocean-based technology capture, really, really exciting stuff going on. To move away from asset class discussion, I think we will continue to see a growth in buy-in on the corporate side. And there are so many factors contributing to this. Not one is a growth in understanding, two, a growth from all the investor pressure groups that exist, and also from consumers. So something to think about, right? So you've got engagement in carbon markets, you've got the buyers of those credits, but you've also got the asset holders who to some extent stipulate the behavior of organizations. And we have already seen, we think we can identify, upwards of about 5-6 trillion assets under management or sort of capital being allocated to this space or to the decarbonization of the corporate world. And as asset holders begin to change their tune and start to introduce net zero aligned strategies, start to introduce certain stipulations on the holdings that they have, we see a potential for pretty fast growth in the market, I think, as organizations respond to that and respond to the fact that the flow of capital around the world is now considering environmental protection as something that's not just a fluffy nice to have, but something that's absolutely integral to the preservation of the world and therefore integral to the growth of the private sector as well.
Thank you. Mark, have you got a forecasting hat that you'd like to wear and put on and tell us what you see coming next year?
So I think the continual conversation around co-benefits be really important, particularly in the Asia region, looking into sort of the countries that have a lot of benefits to gain, particularly around blue carbon. So again, in Australia's context, they have recently invested in a lot of domestic blue carbon projects, but also some internationally based ones, and they very much sort of stipulate and emphasize the co-benefits associated with blue carbon types of projects. So I think that conversation is going to be really sort of continuing on and gaining more prominence in 2023. And related to that is the sort of the importance of biodiversity. So Australia again is also looking at establishing, I think it is a world first national sort of biodiversity market, and they're taking they want to take a lot of lessons learned from the carbon market and apply it to the biodiversity. I think there's an emphasis there on making sure that it's not being used for offsetting purposes, but rather as a sort of an investment in and of itself to sort of increase corporate sort of sustainable development goals and attract sort of new sort of customers and investments and that sort of thing. And I guess, the continuation, the conversation around how to define integrity and quality will sort of keep going on in the background and the foreground sort of thing going forward.
Thank you. Marcelo, would you like to give us an idea of what you think is coming next year?
Yeah, I'll tend to agree with Sam on many aspects. I think there is a fundamental demand growth that's going, and that's not going to go away. That, in my opinion, that's what's keeping prices, reasonably stable, right, in comparison to other asset classes. And you see the emergence of a number of asset managers now that have portfolio of companies and they want to decarbonize. There's real drive there to decarbonize their portfolios. They obviously, the ones that hold significant equity in certain corporates, they actually demanding that to happen directly through the corporate rather than in the portfolios when they manage the portfolios. So I do see that fundamental growth is still going on. However, provided that economic softness that we see now continue, I would predict, I would estimate that the prices will continue at levels roughly of where they are now. Not declining, but also not fantastically going up as we've seen, for example, from 2021 to 2022. Now, 2024 is a different story, right? So if we all did the homework very well, the future is indeed very bright for 2024, and I would be estimating that the economy is kind of taking a turn upwards at that point in time, and then we'll see a very, very different story then.
Nice to know that 2 years from now is the time to be in. Chimin, how about you? What does your 2023 crystal ball tell you?
Yeah, indeed. I think, again, I will start from the, let's say, corporate behavior point of view. I think in 2023, we will see, let's say, a bigger divergence between different size of corporates. Because I think here we mostly focus on, of course, the say, natural leaders, right? Those big multinational corporates. Of course, they cannot do a lot of fancy stuff. To them, I believe they will start investing more directly into those projects instead of procuring the credits. I think that would be, let's say, a fundamental change of their behavior. And of course, I mean, for those investments, they will definitely choose the ones with the, let's say, the highest quality or the most co-benefits, right? Or I think, again, I also agree with Sam. I think the tech-based carbon removal projects will be particularly interesting for attracting those investments from the multinational corporates. But still, we cannot forget that there are still, let's say, medium to small size enterprises. They are now also coming into this market. And especially in the APAC region, since it is a little bit lagging behind historically comparing to Europe and North America. So the other corporates here, including also some big corporates indeed, like the Chinese ones or Japanese ones, South Korean ones, right? So those they're also big, but in terms of the knowledge and expertise in carbon trading, they are far lagging behind than their European counterparts. So to them, I think they will probably go through the same journey as many, let's say, American or European companies have been through. So they will probably still start from the say, simple procurement approach. But at the meantime, I think they will learn very fast, and so they will probably jump to, let's say, the long-term offtake or investing approach as well. And also, let's say, from let's say, a geographical point of view, if we look at, let's say, the main regions where most of the offset projects are located, right? Historically, it was like the Asia, like China, India, and then a bit Africa and South America. But now, since everyone is talking about the nature-based solutions, then I think the APAC region really has a lot of potential for those type of projects, right? I mean, in Africa, I think it's reasonable to assume that it could be quite difficult to develop nature-based solution projects there. But here, I mean, either blue carbon or, say, afforestation, those kind of projects, I think there's a lot of potential. So for the next 1 or 2 years, for sure we'll see a lot more, let's say, new nature-based solution projects will be actually developed in this region. And that will also change the dynamic of the, let's say, or the mix of the supply from different regions. So yeah, it's a bit my view towards the future.
Thank you very much. Cyril, I'm going to give the last word to you. What is in your, what do you expect to see next year from a perspective of, compliance markets, from the perspective of large industrial companies? What do you expect to see?
I would perhaps, what is the response for the last word on the voluntary carbon markets?
Okay.
Because the complex carbon markets will require some time.
Yep.
There will be some progress. On the voluntary carbon market, I want to echo what the colleague says on that a high-quality carbon project is a project that can go beyond carbon component and to maximize the social, the environmental, biodiversity benefits. So in that regards, BHP is really looking at natural-based solutions. And so there will be next year a demand on that type of project. So the supply of very high quality project is also a challenge to unlock. And the last one will be about new methodologies such as blue carbon. BHP is working with Australia CSRO to develop methodologies and enable these methodologies. The last one will be on technology-based removal methodologies. So we believe and look very closely direct air captures, but also carbon mineralization processes that could play a role in the future. I need a scale-up of innovations and robust methodology.
Right. I hope you were here yesterday for the launch of the high-level criteria for carbon geostorage then. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel for giving us an hour of their time and their thought and their experience. So thank you all very much indeed.